One evening, a live TV studio buzzed with energy as millions of viewers at home held their breath. Morgan Freeman, the Hollywood icon with a voice that could soothe storms, stepped onto the stage. At 86, he carried a quiet strength that made hearts skip a beat. The crowd roared, some fans even brushing tears from their cheeks. They weren't just here for a celebrity. They were here for a legend whose words had shaped generations. But something was about to go wrong, and no one saw it coming. What happened next would leave the world stunned. The lights dimmed slightly as Morgan settled into a plush chair, his warm smile lighting up the room. People leaned forward in their seats, eager to catch every word. This wasn't just another interview. It felt like a rare chance to hear life secrets from a man who'd lived it fully. What do you think? Could one question ruin this moment? Drop your guess in the comments below, because this story's about to take a wild turn. Across from Morgan sat Kelly Sanders, a sharp-tongued talk show host known for pushing buttons. Her blonde hair gleamed under the studio lights, and her grin hinted at trouble. She adjusted her notes, then leaned in close. "So, Morgan," she said, her tone smooth but edged with a bite. "You're getting up there in years. Do you ever wake up thinking today could be your last day on Earth?" The crowd froze. A few jaws dropped. The air turned thick, like a storm was brewing. Kelly smirked, clearly enjoying the silence. But Morgan? He didn't even blink. He sat there, hands resting calmly in his lap, his deep eyes locked on hers. The audience shifted, some whispering to each other, others holding their breath. Kelly wasn't done. She tilted her head, her voice dripping with sass. "You've played God on screen, but let's be real. You're just an old guy now. How does it feel knowing your clock's ticking down?" A gasp rippled through the room. An older lady in the front row clutched her chest, her eyes wide. Kelly thought she'd won this round, but Morgan had other plans. Morgan let out a soft sigh, shaking his head just a little. He'd been around too long, decades in Hollywood, facing all kinds of people, to let this rattle him. Inside, though, he wasn't just thinking about himself. This was bigger. He pictured every senior watching at home, every person who'd ever felt tossed aside or disrespected. When he finally spoke, his voice rolled out like thunder, steady and deep. "Kelly," he said, "have you ever sat with someone as they took their very last breath?" The question hit like a wave. Kelly blinked, caught off guard. "Well, she started, but Morgan kept going, gentle but firm. "I have. Too many times." The room went dead quiet. You could hear a pin drop. "I've held friends' hands as they said their goodbyes," he continued. "I've seen amazing people slip away. And you know what they always wish for in the end." Kelly swallowed hard, her confidence fading. The camera caught a woman in the crowd, wiping her eyes. Morgan's words weren't just for Kelly. They were for everyone listening. "They don't wish for more cash or more spotlight," he said, his voice warm but heavy. "They wish they'd loved more, forgiven more, lived more." The audience was hooked now, some tearing up, others nodding like they felt it in their bones. Morgan locked eyes with Kelly. "You asked what it's like to be old. I'll tell you, it's a gift. A gift not everyone gets." The crowd exploded, clapping through their tears. A man in his 70s stood up, fists clenched, like Morgan had just spoken his truth. Kelly gripped her notes, speechless for once. But this was just the beginning. The studio lights flickered as the applause faded, but the energy in the room stayed electric. Morgan Freeman had just turned Kelly Sanders' rude question into a lesson that hit everyone hard. She sat there, clutching her notes like they were a lifeline, her smug grin gone. The audience was still reeling, some wiping tears, others whispering about what Morgan had said. His words about life being a gift lingered, heavy and real. Kelly wasn't ready to back down, though. She needed to take control again, and what she said next only dug her hole deeper. Kelly forced a shaky laugh, brushing her hair back. "Well, Morgan, you're quite the speaker," she said, her voice tight. "But let's get real. People your age, they kind of fade out in Hollywood, right? Don't you feel like the world's moved on without you?" The crowd gasped again. A young woman in the back shook her head, muttering under her breath. An older guy in a plaid shirt tightened his grip on his seat, his jaw clenched. Kelly thought she'd landed a punch, But Morgan just leaned back, rubbing his fingers together like he was sizing her up. He didn't rush to answer. Morgan took his time, letting the silence stretch. The camera zoomed in on his face, those wise, steady eyes that had seen it all. Then he smiled, soft and knowing. "Kelly," he said, his voice low and rich, "let me tell you a little story." The room went still. People leaned in closer, hanging on every word. When Morgan Freeman tells a story, you don't just listen, you feel it. And this one was about to change everything. "There was this kid once," Morgan started, his tone warm like a campfire tale. "Young, full of big dreams, thought he'd own the world forever. But years went by, and that kid grew old. One day, he noticed something. The same folks who used to cheer him on? They'd stopped looking his way." A woman in the crowd pressed her hand to her mouth, her eyes glistening. Morgan kept going. He could have gotten mad, felt forgotten. But one night, he sat by his window, watching a storm roll across the sky. The audience was locked in now. You could feel the weight of his words settling over them. "That old man realized something," Morgan said, his voice dropping softer. "Even when the clouds cover it up, the sun's still there, still burning bright, still giving light." A quiet sob broke the silence. A guy in his 60s dabbed his eyes with his sleeve. Morgan turned to Kelly, his gaze kind but piercing. "You call it fading, Kelly. I call it wisdom. And wisdom? It never goes out of style." The crowd lost it. People jumped to their feet, clapping loud enough to shake the walls. A teenage girl hugged her grandma, both of them teary-eyed. Kelly sat frozen, her lips parted like she wanted to argue but couldn't find the words. Morgan's story wasn't just a comeback, it was a mirror, reflecting back at everyone watching. And Kelly? She was starting to see she'd picked the wrong fight. She cleared her throat, trying to shake off the moment. "Okay, Morgan," she said, forcing a smirk. "Let's switch gears. Your childhood wasn't easy, was it? Mom cleaned houses, Dad walked out when you were little. Ever feel bitter about having to claw your way up while others had it easy?" The question stung the air. The audience tensed, waiting. Kelly thought she'd finally cornered him. But Morgan just smiled again, slow and steady, like he'd been waiting for this one all night. What he said next would stick with everyone forever. The studio buzzed with tension as Kelly Sanders' latest jab hung in the air. She'd brought up Morgan Freeman's tough childhood, his mom scrubbing floors, his dad leaving him behind, hoping to rattle him. The crowd held its breath, eyes darting between the two. Kelly smirked, thinking she'd finally found a crack in his armor. But Morgan just sat there, calm as ever, his fingers tapping the armrest. Then he smiled, a slow, deep smile that promised something big. The audience leaned in, sensing he was about to drop a truth they'd never forget. Morgan's voice came out smooth and steady, like a river running deep. "Yeah, my dad walked out," he said. "And my mom? She cleaned houses to keep us going. Bitter about it?"
No, Kelly.
"I'm thankful for them." The room went quiet, stunned. Kelly blinked, her smirk fading fast. "Thankful?" she muttered, almost to herself. Morgan nodded, his eyes shining with something powerful. "My dad showed me what kind of man I didn't want to be. And my mom, she taught me how to keep pushing no matter what." A woman in the crowd let out a soft cry, covering her face. Another guy, gray hair peeking under his cap, nodded like he'd lived that same lesson. Morgan leaned forward, locking eyes with Kelly. "Pain's a tough teacher, Kelly," he said, his voice warm but firm. "But it taught me how to stand tall. I don't carry my past like a weight. I carry it like a badge. It reminds me I'm still here." The audience burst into applause, some standing up, hands shaking with emotion. A young mom in the back whispered, "That's beautiful," her voice breaking. Kelly shifted in her seat, rattled. She'd wanted Morgan to stumble, but he turned her question into something raw and real. The cameras caught every second, her fingers tightening on her notes, her breath catching. She tried to laugh it off, but it came out weak. "Well, that's something," she said, fumbling. Morgan didn't push her. He just sat back, letting his words sink in. The crowd was still clapping, some wiping their eyes, feeling every bit of what he'd shared. But Kelly wasn't giving up yet. She straightened up, forcing her confidence back. "Okay, Morgan," she said, her tone sharp again. "You're 86. You've had an amazing run. But aren't you ever scared? Time doesn't wait for anybody." The question cut through the noise, cold and blunt. A few people gasped. An older man in the front row shook his head, muttering, "She didn't just say that." Kelly crossed her arms, waiting for Morgan to crack. Instead, he chuckled, soft and low, like he'd seen this coming a mile away. Morgan leaned in, his eyes warm but steady. "Kelly," he said, "you want to know the difference between being scared and having faith?" The audience hushed, hanging on his every word. Kelly frowned, unsure where this was going. "Being scared," Morgan went on, "is when you think the worst is coming. Faith is when you believe the best is still out there." A tear slid down a woman's cheek in the crowd. "Every day I wake up," he said, "I choose faith." The room felt smaller, like his voice was wrapping everyone in it. Kelly swallowed, her tough act slipping. The audience was a mess, some crying, others nodding like they'd just found a piece of themselves in his words. Morgan glanced at an older lady in the front row, her hands trembling as she smiled at him. "You get it, don't you?" he asked her gently. She nodded, whispering, "Yes." Kelly looked around, realizing she was losing her grip. But Morgan wasn't done teaching her, or the world, yet. What came next would shake her even more. The studio hummed with raw emotion as Morgan Freeman's words about faith over fear sank deep into everyone's hearts. Kelly Sanders sat across from him, her tough shell cracking. She'd thrown a hard question his way, expecting him to falter, but instead, he turned it into something beautiful. The audience was hooked. Tears streaked down faces, hands clasped tight. A young guy in the crowd whispered to his buddy, "Man, he's unreal." Kelly's producers watched from the control booth, probably sweating as she lost her edge. But she wasn't ready to let go of the reins just yet. Kelly forced a tight smile, shifting in her seat. "All right, Morgan," she said, her voice sharper now. "Enough of the deep stuff. Let's talk about your legacy. What do you think folks will say about you when you're gone?" The room went quiet again, the question landing like a stone. It was bold, maybe even harsh, but Kelly thought she'd finally get him off balance. The crowd waited, eyes wide. An older woman in a blue sweater gripped her purse, her breath catching. Morgan just chuckled low and easy, shaking his head like he'd heard a kid ask something silly. "Kelly," he said, leaning in a little, "you're asking the wrong thing." Her eyebrows shot up. "What?" she snapped, confused. Morgan's voice dropped, warm but steady. "It's not about what they'll say when I'm gone. It's about what they'll say about you." The audience gasped, a wave of shock rolling through them. Kelly froze, her hands gripping her notes so tight they crinkled. This wasn't an interview anymore, it was a wake-up call, and Morgan was holding the megaphone. He sat back, his eyes kind but sharp. "See, I've spent my life telling stories," he said. "Stories that lift people up, help them see the world clearer. When my time's up, I know I'll leave something good behind." The crowd was silent, soaking it in. "But you, Kelly," he added, pausing for effect, "you've got this big stage. And so far, you've used it to poke at people to pull them down." A quiet sob escaped from the back. Kelly stared at her lap, her face pale. Morgan's voice softened. "Thing is, it's not too late to switch that up." A tear slipped down Kelly's cheek, catching the light. She didn't wipe it away. The audience watched, stunned. This wasn't the Kelly they knew, the one who always had a quick comeback. A man in his 50s rubbed his chin, eyes misty, like he was rethinking his own life. Morgan kept going, gentle but firm. "Real strength isn't about how loud you talk, Kelly. It's about knowing when to shut up and listen." Another tear fell. Kelly's breath hitched, and for the first time, she looked small, human, not untouchable. The camera zoomed in, capturing her shaky hands, her wet eyes. She tried to speak. She whispered, her voice cracking. Morgan leaned closer, like a dad calming a scared kid. "You've asked a lot of tough questions over the years," he said. But have you ever turned that spotlight on yourself? Kelly squeezed her eyes shut, a sob breaking free. The crowd was a mess, some crying, others staring in awe. This wasn't just a TV moment. It was a crack in Kelly's world, and Morgan had pried it open with nothing but kindness. She took a ragged breath, her shoulders trembling. "I don't know," she murmured, almost too quiet to hear. "I don't know if I like what they'll say about me." Morgan smiled, soft and steady. "Then change it, Kelly," he said. "Rewrite your story." The audience gasped again, a few people clapping, then more joining in. Kelly's tears flowed freely now, not from defeat, but from something new stirring inside her. Morgan had flipped the script, and she wasn't the only one feeling it. The whole world was about to see what happened next. The studio lights seemed softer now, but the air crackled with something huge. Kelly Sanders sat there, tears streaking her face, her tough mask shattered. Morgan Freeman had just told her to rewrite her story, and those words hit her like a freight train. Millions of people at home, glued to their screens, watched her unravel, not from embarrassment, but from a truth she couldn't dodge. The audience in the room was a puddle of emotions, some sniffling, others staring wide-eyed. A guy in a baseball cap whispered to his wife, "She's done for." But this wasn't about Kelly breaking. It was about her waking up. Kelly took a shaky breath, her hands trembling on her lap. For years, she'd been the queen of hard-hitting questions, the one who made guests squirm. Now, Morgan had flipped it all around, and she was the one squirming. She looked at him, her eyes red and raw. "Morgan," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "if you could tell the world one thing before you go, what would it be?" The crowd leaned in, hearts pounding. This wasn't her usual gotcha question. This was real, vulnerable, like she was asking for herself as much as for them. Morgan paused, letting the moment breathe. He glanced at the audience, then up at the ceiling, like he was pulling the answer from somewhere deep. Finally, he smiled, a warm, gentle smile that felt like a hug. "Kelly," he said, his voice rich and steady, "life isn't about how long you're here. It's about how much love you leave behind." A woman in the front row let out a loud sob, her shoulders shaking. Another guy clapped once, then stopped, too choked up to keep going. Morgan's words weren't fancy. They were simple, pure, and heavy with truth. The room erupted. People shot to their feet, clapping so hard it echoed off the walls. Tears flowed freely now. A young woman squeezed her friend's hand. An older man rested his head in his palms, overwhelmed. Even the camera crew blinked back tears, their lenses shaky as they zoomed in on Morgan. Kelly pressed a hand to her chest, her breath ragged. "Morgan," she said, her voice breaking, "you just changed me." He chuckled, soft and warm. "Nah, Kelly," he replied. "You changed yourself." The applause grew louder, a wave of sound that filled every corner. This wasn't just a talk show anymore, it was a moment that felt bigger than life. Morgan stood up slowly, his 86 years showing in his careful steps, but his presence towering over everything. He gave Kelly a small nod, a quiet "you've got this" kind of look. Then he turned to the crowd, raising a hand to quiet them. They hushed instantly, hanging on his next move. "My friends," he said, his voice thick with feeling, "I've been around a long time. I've seen hurt. I've seen loss. But you know what's stronger than all that?" The audience was silent, waiting. A little girl in the back clutched her mom's arm, eyes wide. Morgan smiled again, softer this time. "Love," he said. "Love beats everything." A fresh round of tears hit the crowd. A woman hugged the stranger next to her, both of them crying. Morgan took a breath, looking out at the sea of faces. "So tonight, when you leave here, do me a favor. Call someone you care about. Tell them they matter. Forgive someone you've been mad at. Life's too short to hold back." The room exploded again, clapping, cheering, sobbing, all mixed together. Kelly stood too, wiping her face, her notes forgotten on the chair. She looked at Morgan, a shaky smile breaking through. "That's your legacy," she said, loud enough for the mics to catch. Morgan turned back to her, his eyes twinkling. "No," he said softly. This is. With that, he walked off the stage, slow and steady, leaving behind a crowd forever changed and a host who'd never be the same. The cameras lingered on Kelly for a second. She stood there, hands clasped, tears still wet on her cheeks. Then the screen faded to black, but the feeling didn't. People at home sat stunned, some reaching for their phones to call loved ones right then and there. Back in the studio, the applause didn't stop, even after Morgan was gone. This wasn't just a story, it was a spark, lighting up hearts everywhere. Hey, you watching this right now, what hit you the hardest? Was it Morgan's words about love, or Kelly's big turnaround? Drop it in the comments, because this moment's too good to keep to yourself. Hit that like button if it moved you, and subscribe so you don't miss another story that'll shake you to your core. Morgan said it best, life's about the love you give. So, who are you calling tonight?